Master Chief is a Spartan-II, but who were the Spartan-Is? Spartans are genetically modified super soldiers used in special operations. They were instrumental in quelling the insurrectionists and, eventually, in holding back the Covenant. But their beginnings started far before humanity had even stretched into the outer colonies, hundreds of years before the Covenant War. But why create super soldiers back then? Well, my name is SameToken, and today we'll be exploring the first generation of Spartans in the ORION Project. Following the invention of the first slipstream space engine in the early 2290s, which effectively enabled faster-than-light travel, the unified Earth government quickly unveiled a new line of colony ships. At this point, Earth had become severely overpopulated, resulting in a grave reduction in quality of life. Thus, hitching the first ride outside of the Sol system became an attractive alternative when they officially launched the ships in 2310. To oversee humanity's expansion, the Colonial Military Administration was created, assuming jurisdiction over all military operations outside of the Sol system, while the UNSC maintained authority around Earth. This era was a turning point for humanity, birthing what would become known as the Inner Colonies, and, along with this, a boom in scientific discovery. During this period, the Colonial Military Administration were interested in increasing the performance of their elite troops. This was likely because the frontier was sparsely populated, forcing them to do more with less. Their mission in maintaining the peace on the new colonies was essential for human expansion. Any disruption could have set them back decades. Thus, the Office of Naval Intelligence was commissioned to investigate biological methods of enhancing the combat effectiveness of soldiers. Even before the extrasolar colonization efforts, the unified Earth government had already been aggressively researching new biotechnologies for military use in what they called the Blue Sky Projects. And so, the Office of Naval Intelligence commandeered the resources from these initiatives, and in 2315 consolidated them into the ORION Project. By the time human trials began 6 years later, 7 volunteers from the military successfully completed what they called body sculpting, transplant integration, and neurosurgery cycle. Current records do not elaborate on what these procedures involved, nor how many initial recruits there were. However, what we do know is that results were poor. There was no consistency between subject performance, and the costs were skyrocketing. And something clearly spooked the leadership. Perhaps they saw the ethical implications, or maybe it was just the lack of a return on their colossal investment. Regardless, they quickly shut down the program and reintegrated the test subjects back into active service. Yet, horrifyingly, every subject died within a year. The Office of Naval Intelligence would never disclose why. This was helped in part by many of the digital records from this period degrading or going missing. ORION was completely abandoned, likely becoming a mere footnote in the Office of Naval Intelligence's growing roster of unethical projects. By the end of that century, colonization efforts were hugely successful. Hundreds of worlds had been terraformed to livable conditions. Because of the expense of interstellar travel at the time, only the elite could afford to relocate to other solar systems. But over time, as the expansion rapidly continued, travel became more affordable. While the worlds closest to Earth were still far too expensive for many, the new frontier, known as the Outer Colonies, were lucratively cheap. However, at the end of the 25th century, almost 200 years after humanity first left the solar system, the unified Earth government found it increasingly difficult to maintain control over the outer colonies, with rebellions beginning to form. And at the same time, the Colonial Military Administration were losing jurisdiction to the UNSC, who were expanding their authority outside of the Sol system. With terrorist attacks and insurrections increasing across the colonies, the Office of Naval Intelligence once again sought to improve the combat effectiveness of soldiers. In the interest of speed, they took over management of the inactive ORION Project from the Colonial Military Administration. This allowed them to benefit from its authority and ethical waivers that allowed them to perform near unrestricted human experimentation using regulations set out over 160 years prior. To put this in perspective, that would be like a government organization in the year 2020 purchasing ethical waivers for human experimentation created during the American Civil War. Thanks to this administrative fast track, the new ORION project was underway, initially recruiting 65 volunteers. Headquartered on an orbital dock above the planet Reach, candidates underwent extreme training exercises and experimental biochemical enhancements. However, no technology was transferred from the original project, instead all being developed in-house within the recent decades. This gave them the benefit of over 100 years of scientific innovation. ORION augmentations included gene therapy to increase neurological adaptability, retina inversion injections to improve sight, muscular enhancement injections for superior muscle density, and cochlea enhancement tuning to improve hearing. Unlike the previous program, the new ORION project was proving successful, producing hundreds of seemingly stable, enhanced soldiers. Due to this apparent achievement, the Office of Naval Intelligence began deploying the ORION candidates against the rebels as the insurrections continued to escalate. Although they were not living up to the performance expectations set by the scientists, the ORIONs were still proving highly useful in combat. Thus, hundreds more ORIONs were conscripted, trained, and augmented, eventually totaling at around 300 in active duty. These soldiers were like nothing people had ever seen before, but the experimental nature of the program started to show its cracks. Some of the first conscripts began exhibiting flaws that were initially ignored. Post-traumatic stress disorder was highly common among the ORIONs. And then, as they increased in number, they found many of the augmentations were being rejected by the candidates' bodies, requiring their removal. But ultimately, their largest limitation was money. While the Colonial Military Administration was still funding the project, their resources were slowly being reallocated towards the UNSC, while the organization itself was being internally reshuffled. And eventually, in 2506, just 15 years after its inception, ORION was quietly deactivated, with its remaining 165 operators being reassigned to special operations across the UNSC. One such ORION, through their sacrifice, would become instrumental in saving not only humanity, but likely the entire galaxy. Avery Johnson was an early volunteer of the second phase of the project. He participated in some of the most important military operations against the insurrectionists and, eventually, the Covenant. Johnson is a success story for ORION, boasting superior abilities than his fellow normal Marines. And while we can't be sure of his biological age thanks to the effects of cryosleep, the ORION project likely extended his usefulness during active service. Even later iterations of ORION would respect what he had accomplished. And when the time came, he would be sent out with a bang. Unlike Johnson, however, the side effects from the augmentations continued to worsen in many, resulting in large numbers of ORIONs being discharged due to mental instability. To ensure the project's secrecy, their side effects were dubbed Boren syndrome. Yet despite this, many of ORIONs did remain in active duty, outliving their non-augmented counterparts. Meanwhile, orbital drop shock troopers, who now base themselves on the ORION training model, replaced them during specialized missions. In 2510, an unnamed person wished to conduct a tissue biopsy series on active duty ORION personnel, but this was ultimately rejected. But tracing the service number, and it appears this was Dr. Catherine Halsey, a scientist who was seeking to reignite a similar soldier-enhancing program to fight against the insurrectionists. In her journal, she praised the original direction of ORION, but felt the project team were, as she puts it, amateurs led by uninformed career military. According to Halsey, there were 3 major problems with ORION. The first was the candidate pool. Subjects were taken from various UNSC special forces who were too old to undergo genetic augmentation. This resulted in degenerative neurological conditions. Second was their lack of genetic screening. It appears they accepted almost any volunteer, irrespective of their compatibility. And finally, and this is perhaps a culmination of the other issues, ORION candidates exhibited post-traumatic stress disorder or repressed insurgent sympathies. Those in the latter category identified with the insurrectionists on some level, refusing to participate in ORION activities, which eventually resulted in their incarceration. Dr. Halsey would attempt to remedy these challenges after being approved funding for a new generation of the ORION Project by using children. Feeling the name ORION was uninspiring, this would become known as the Spartan-II project. As the ORIONs aged, some of them went on to have children who turned out to be different. Because of their augmentations, their offspring were physically superior to average humans. With ORION being retroactively renamed the Spartan-I Project, these children were known colloquially as the Spartan 1.1s. Now, before I continue, the Spartan 1.1s are referenced in the alternate reality game I Love Bees. This was a viral marketing campaign created on the lead up to Halo 2, which you can find out more about in my Halo 2 retrospective. Basically, although Bungie were on the fence, 343 has suggested that they embrace I Love Bees as canon unless it is contradicted elsewhere. So, the 16 Spartan 1.1s experienced a relatively normal early childhood thanks to the cocktail of injections they were given as they aged. This ensured their parents' augmentations did not cause defects as they grew. Yet, they still managed to retain many of the benefits. For instance, the 1.1s had a higher than average intelligence, enhanced vision and hearing, and increased strength. And this appeared to spark the interest of the Office of Naval Intelligence as they began their Spartan-II program. They likely thought that a Spartan 1.1 would make an excellent candidate for the next generation of super soldiers. In seeking gifted children for this new program, an agent was sent to scout out one of the 1.1s, Janissary James, when she was only 6. Observing her without permission, she passed all of their requirements, leading him to want to recruit her for the initiative. However, when he came to abduct her, as the program dictated, Janissary's father, an ex-ORION, shot and killed him. But this would not stop the Spartan-II project from proceeding to abduct and indoctrinate other gifted children. Ultimately, although not its initial purpose, Project ORION perhaps saved humanity. The research gathered would eventually be used to develop future Spartan programs. Without the ORIONs paving the way, there would have been no Noble Six to defend the Pillar of Autumn, no Master Chief to stop the Gravemind, and no Spartan 4s who overcame many of ORION's limitations. Even the ORIONs themselves could hold their own, with Avery Johnson's heroism leading to the defeat of the Flood. And so, we really do have the ORION Project to thank for the success of the future Spartans. So, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe and hit the bell icon for more. I'd like to give a huge thanks for all your support. This channel honestly couldn't exist without you. So stay safe out there, and I'll catch you next time.